What is going on, guys? Welcome back to the Sixers Digest YouTube channel. My name is Barnard, as always, and here I'm to dive into the James Harden saga once again. Rachel Nichols continues to make an interesting point regarding Harden's perspective, his outlook, and she's kind of doubled and tripled down on this a couple times now. So I wanted to dive into her specific comments, the outlook from Harden, what I take from these, and what we should kind of expect moving forward. Now, Rachel Nichols is someone who's had a pretty good relationship with James Harden when it comes to their past. She's the same one that gave that famous interview where Harden kind of calls out Giannis back when that was a big-time beef back in the Harden MVP days, where he talked about how I wish I could just be 7 foot and dunk, and that's how easy the game is for me. It's a little more difficult because I have to be more skilled. That was a huge thing at the time. That looks like water in the bridge, and neither of those two care about it. But she is someone that is pretty much on the scene with James Harden, and I do think it's important to put that in the context when you're talking about things. So let's dive into her specific comments, and then we'll go from there. There's two that I want to pull up here. Number one, we have this from Rachel Nichols saying that James Harden still wants to be the number one option on a team again. And this is from Undisputed. She said, quote, "He thinks he should be leading the show. The reason why he wanted out of Philadelphia in the first place is that it's the Joel Embiid show right now." Now, that's absolutely the case. It's very clearly Joel Embiid's team. This is a guy who's led the NBA in scoring in 2 consecutive years, the reigning MVP, a guy who's been top 2 in MVP voting for the top 3 years, and that shouldn't be a surprise. That is what James Harden signed up when he came to Philadelphia. Now, I want to take a look at another quote from Nichols here, and then we'll get into things. So another one says, quote, "James Harden still thinks of himself as the guy from Game 1 versus Celtics. He thinks he is leading the show. The reason why he wanted out of Philadelphia in the first place is because that is the Joel Embiid show." So more of the same here, but she has kind of repackaged this and kind of doubled and tripled down on this throughout during her time on Undisputed. It is an interesting perspective and something that I don't think there's quite enough weight being held to, but it is something that it's the confusing James Harden story. Because as she just brought up, we've seen the Game 1 flashes. We've seen him score 40-plus points in the playoffs. We've seen him been able to catch lightning in the bottle and kind of turn back the clock and have those moments once in a while, but they're not what you can get on a consistent basis. And for me personally, and I know a lot of Sixers fans, the greatest frustration of James Harden, and once again, I understand part of this is the James Harden experience, but the biggest frustration is the highs are so high and the lows are so low with him. That when he is locked in and playing his best basketball, very few people in the world are as good at that sport as him. But when he is playing poorly and the turnovers are happening and the pace of play is slow, it's incredibly frustrating and really difficult to win with him on the court. Now, the first thing that I want to do in this topic of conversation is I wanted to dive into the stats of James Harden without Joel Embiid this season. It was not as large of a sample size as I expected, and the Sixers throughout their time on the court together in the games, and both of them did play, have done have made it a priority to keep them together. They have not staggered their minutes in the way that personally I would suggest that they do. Part of that is a Doc Rivers thing, and their reasoning behind this was that they're so good together that we want to keep that duo going and keep that. That brings up the whole frustration, the all-bench lineups, and all these other things. But let's take a look at the games in which Joel Embiid did not play and James Harden did. So 7 games this season, and Harden in those matchups averaged 20.6 points, 9.4 assists, and 6.4 rebounds. So solid stats there, but not exactly the throwback MVP numbers that you would want to expect. And in comparison, let's look at James Harden's stats as a whole this season. So here are James Harden's stats on the season: 21 points, 6.1 rebounds, 10.7 assists. The 44.1% from the field and the 38.5% from 3, I do believe, are notable. That 3-point percentage is the best that he's done in about a decade. That since his early OKC days, that statistically is the best shooting percentage that he's had. Of course, the volume and the quality of looks do matter with the context of this. But I do think it's interesting that the biggest takeaway between, once again, the stats without Joel Embiid and the stats with him is that assist number. We see the dip from 10.7 to 9.4 there. Over 1 assist per game is a pretty notable dip when we talk about that. And that one would assume that James Harden is more in attack mode, but we did not see that point number raised. So going from 21 points per game with or as a whole on the season to 20, just under that without Embiid, is not super encouraging. A couple other things that I did want to dive into here. I wanted to pull up these stats with the rest days. I've seen a lot of talk about Harden being better on multiple days of rest. It wasn't as strong as I expected, and a lot of this is small sample size. You can very clearly see that the vast majority is playing on 1 day's rest. There is 39 games there. Only 8 games with 2 days rest and 7 games with 3+ days rest, as well as 4 games with 0-day rest. And these stats do not kind of speak to that narrative of Harden being better with multiple days rest. You can kind of look at these numbers here, the points per game. His best number in this is with 0 days rest at 23.8 points, 10.9 assists. I do think that should be noted that, small sample size, only 4 games, the smallest in this category. And when you look at that 3-day rest number, you do see the points climb here. Only a 7-game sample size in this, but averaging 24.6 points per game. And you see the assist drop at 8.6 assists per game there. So I do think that was a little interesting to take a look at, but it wasn't as convincing as I honestly expected to see when I dove in that numbers. That I expected there to be a night and day difference because you can kind of feel it in his play. And honestly, the what has given me the least optimism when we talk about the throwback James Harden performances and what he still has the tank is when he had those games in the playoffs. To me, watching, it did not feel as if all of a sudden this guy's got it. It felt like he just hit tough shots, that he wasn't shaking guys. He wasn't creating separation in the same way that we've seen from him in years past. It just felt like the shots were going in. Like even that game winner versus Al Horford, you can go back and watch that. I'm going to avoid the highlights for the copyright reasons on here for now. But when you go back and watch that, Al Horford was in his grill. That was as defended as good as possible. Now, is James Harden the quality of player that sometimes that style of defense just doesn't matter? Absolutely. That's kind of been the story for him, is that he's so talented offensively that it really does not matter what you do to him when he is locked in and on. And a couple other James Harden stats just stylistically that I wanted to share with you guys. And I'll read off the notebook here. Make sure I get these all correct. These were from NBA.com. But, of course, we have Harden average 20.6 points, 9.4 assists, and 6.7 rebounds without Embiid. He also led the NBA in isolation frequency this year at 30.3%. He did rank in the 83.9% percentile in that category. Still very efficient in those isolation looks. 1.1 points per possession in isolation, which is pretty good. Anything over 1, you're very happy with as an offensive player. And that was on 6.2 possessions a game. He produced 6.8 points per game in that category. 49.1% effective field goal possession, which those touches aren't awesome, but the 1.1 points per possession is what takes the cake and what you look at most in that situation. The other things that I wanted to touch on, 48.6% of his field goal attempts occurred after 6+ seconds with the basketball. Some of that's natural. He's obviously a point guard, going to have the ball in his hand a ton, but it does speak to that slow pace. And to double down on that, 42.9% of James Harden's field goal attempts occurred after 7+ dribbles. That's a lot. In addition, he was also third in the NBA in total touches per game this year at 93.8, trailed only Nikola Jokic and Tyrese Halliburton in that category, and he was second in the NBA in individual time of possession. He trailed only Luka Doncic with that number. James Harden recorded 8.6 minutes of game with the basketball in his hands. Jalen Brunson was the only one really in the vicinity with 8.5 right behind him, but that is kind of the numbers that we were putting at. So when you get that high usage and high caliber of a guy with the ball in his hands, you have to be very, very good in that touches. To speak about the lead option is a very interesting story because we've seen the years of James Harden as the primary guy. We've seen those years in Houston. And honestly, those teams did have much more success than I think they're giving credit. They ran into the buzzsaw that is the prime Golden State Warriors, which are just an impossible team to take down. One of the greatest NBA teams we've ever seen assemble, arguably the greatest team assemble. So I do think it's fair how often those playoff woes are thrown in James Harden's face. But the point still remains that you could not get over the hump with James Harden as the primary option back then. Now looking at him at 34 years old with much more mileage on his legs, we see the injuries have started to flail up of recently. I just don't see a world where that is a recipe for championship success. And on the other hand, it takes a team to believe that is the case to go and make that investment, go get James Harden. And as we see with this stagnant trade market, there's just not a team jumping out to get James Harden. Really, the Los Angeles Clippers are the only team having the conversations or that seem to even want James Harden. And he's going to be number 3 in the pecking order there behind Kawhi Leonard and Paul George. So he's not going to be the primary option there. Really, the only case in which he could be that primary option is it speaks to a flashback of kind of the Houston Rockets whispers that we heard all year, of him kind of captaining a young team, being that leader. But that only speaks from a developmental track, and it's hard when you put him in that spot that you're taking the ball out of guys' hands so much. That the only time James Harden is locked in and effective on a basketball court is when he has the ball in his hands. To take the ball out of guys like Jalen Green and Jabari Smith and Alperen Sengun and Tari Eason and all these young talents that they have down in Houston for 8.6 minutes per game is not going to help anybody. And I don't see the Rockets being of any interest anymore. We saw that they made the decision. They went with Dylan Brooks, went with Fred VanVleet. They've got their veterans that they want to surround that young core with. And frankly, I think it's the right decision from their developmental track that Jalen Green's going to get far more out of playing through his mistakes, having the freedom, and having guys that can play off him rather than Jalen Green playing off James Harden. But for James Harden, the question now brings, what do you want, my guy? That it is very confusing to understand what his perspective is. And let me pull up the accolades of James Harden here. We all know who he is. He's a 10-time All-Star, a 3-time scoring champ, 2-time assist champ, 7-time All-NBA team member, 2017, 2018 MVP, one of the top 75 players to ever play the sport ever. He's one of 7 guys to both lead the league in scoring and lead the league in assists in separate years. He is one of the best basketball players of all time. But his career is dwindling. We are down to the final few years of James Harden, and it is up to him to decide what he wants to make of those. We've seen many different paths for stars as they kind of trail into the twilight of the career. You can take kind of the Vince Carter method, where you become comfortable in being more of a low usage guy, being a good veteran, being a good role player on a team, and you can still be effective in that. James Harden can absolutely still be effective in that role if he accepts that. We've also seen the moments where guys flail out, are unable to find success. James Harden is a more talented basketball player than Russell Westbrook, but it's still a fair comparison in terms of fit on a team that Russell Westbrook refuses to kind of accept until recently. I will give him credit. With the Clippers, I think he has found new life, found a new belonging, and is kind of helping a team in a way that he was unable to do with the Lakers, even with the Rockets. I'll throw in that conversation, a number of other stops. James Harden has to accept that he has to play differently at this stage of his career. I thought he was doing this by coming to Philadelphia. I thought that was the decision, that he was okay with taking a back seat. Let me join Joel Embiid. Let me get him to these MVP levels. Let me help him to take his game to another level, because he is an excellent playmaker, a guy that can grow the players around him to another level. But if he still has this burning desire to be the number one guy, I don't see this working for James Harden, and I see very few teams that are going to see that the same way. So really, as much as there's noise about the trade conversations, the what to expect, all these other things, it's going to take James Harden taking a real look in the mirror and understand, maybe I'm just not that guy anymore. And there is nothing wrong with that. There are basically no examples of players having the best years of their career at age 34 and beyond. This is the time where that naturally happens, and he still can absolutely have success. He has still the skill to survive in today's NBA, the ability to survive, but the mentality is going to be the thing that holds him back. So for now, we got to sit back. It's on James Harden to have those conversations. And as I mentioned with all this, and I continue to reinforce in these videos, the bottom line is he's under contract with these Sixers. So if there is not a trade, he's expected to join the Sixers, play his part to the best of his ability, and help the team as much as he possibly can. Whether or not he's willing to do that will change things as well. But we've seen guys with not as much talent as James Harden, but when the window for the headache eclipses the talent that you have on the court, you find yourself out of the NBA very quickly. I don't expect that to happen with James Harden. I think there will be a point where he at least gets it together enough. But these headaches, these headlines, these aren't good for anybody, and the biggest shoe falls on James Harden for that. Appreciate you guys for tuning in to this video. Make sure to drop a like on this video, drop a subscribe on this channel. Only 95% of you tuning in are not subscribed. So I want to change that. Let's get that number a little better. Ring that bell. Make sure you're not missing out on any of the awesome content here on Sixers Digest. And I'll be back breaking down some things. I got some cool things in the works, hoping to do some breakdowns of kind of the Pro-Am stuff, the Rico Hines run, some of the players popping out there. So I'll be back with you soon right here on Sixers Digest. Peace.